when we left off last time, the Colt Peacemaker Model P Single Action Army was adopted as U.S. Army's, U.S. Cavalry's Model 1873, often just called the New Army Revolver, although names are all over the place. Now, this is my 5.5-inch artillery version, and I will talk about in this video why I picked this one. But this is the version that's iconic for the 19th century, the 7.5-inch cavalry version. As I said in the last episode, this is Pieta, the other one's Zebretti. I kind of already gave my opinion. And there are a lot of you Pieta fans online, and for valid reasons. I think maybe it's kind of a gun-to-gun basis. Now, this one here is a Henry Nettleton-proofed example. He's one of the many inspectors, but he did not come about until around 1878. The first ones were marked OWA, and that would be the first 14,000 or so, like we talked about. There's an initial order of 8,000, and then that would turn into an add-on order up to 6,000 in 1874. And they were all this long version and 45 Colt. Originally, it was a 4.54 diameter, 255 grain over 40 black powder grains projectile. Yeah, it was a big honking round. And they picked this over the Smith & Wesson #3 American, which was in 44 Smith & Wesson, sometimes called 44 American. And you think that would be that. This was picked, and there it goes. And many in the Army, especially the infantry, were very happy with this choice. But the cavalry, they still had reservations and a lobby. And so while things would die down for a little bit of time, by 1875, they're kind of back to test and evaluating guns. And it looks like the Colt's reign may be very brief. Of course, as we know today, it wasn't, but could have been. Because this Challenger came to be the Smith & Wesson #3, second pattern as it happens here, Schofield, in 45 Schofield. Before we dive into this, as always, if you could, sincerely, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd really like to help support the channel, there's always Patreon or Super Thanks on YouTube. Revolver videos don't get a whole lot of attention, but you know what? Those who do watch them, I'm doing it for you. I hope you enjoy it. I have had a heck of a lot of fun learning about these. These are all from Cimarron. And, well, throughout the shooting clips, you'll see me kind of adapting to them and developing a new skill set, or at least refreshing a skill set I had as a kid, and haven't done a lot of revolver shooting in recent years. So, yeah, it'll be good. Let's just dive in. Let's try the Smith. And the half cock on this is kind of interesting. It doesn't really move back much. It's enough to clear that open. Of course, need to do that. And then drop our shells in. Of course, the originals were in 45 Schofield, which had a little different rim, and was overall just a little bit of a shorter cartridge because it was based on the 44 American, 44 Russian, that whole line. Oops, fumble. Imagine if that was on horseback. Speed loaders would have been a good thing back then. But yeah, newer ones like this, they've kind of overcome the challenges, and it'll work. In the previous video, I showed you the Smith & Wesson #3, the Russian version, with the kind of two-handed latch system. Well, Major George Schofield of the 10th Cavalry, I believe it was, developed this single hand, really single finger system here pulling back on the rear sight, kind of like you see on a Webley type of thing. He also kind of pushed Smith & Wesson to have more modern heat treat and update the latch spring a bit. Basically just make the gun better suited for cavalry use, because one of the big complaints with the number 3 American, people like the Star Extractor. The cavalry certainly did, being able to unload and reload. It empties out quick on horseback, great deal, but it just wasn't durable enough. So his 2 deal was, 1, to make it, you can do it by one hand, and 2, make it durable enough for hard use on the frontier out west. At the same time, the 44 Smith cartridge just wasn't strong enough. So in 1874-75, they developed what would ultimately become 45 Schofield. And it was kind of part of the whole contract thing. Now, there is another round of evaluation by the Ordnance Board. And Smith & Wesson, I think, does submit the American again, and they do submit the Schofield. But this time, this gun actually sort of beats this gun. Well, sort of. It's kind of a parallel thing. They pretty much judge over the next couple of years, evaluating. They're equal. Smith & Wesson will make roughly 3,000 of this first variation here, beginning in 1875, running through the next year or so. And of those, the majority would go to the U.S. Army, and specifically the cavalry. Why is this? Well, I said George Schofield designed it. Well, it just so happens that John Schofield, his older brother, was pretty much in charge of the Ordnance Evaluation Board. No issues there, I'm sure. Yeah. So it was picked. Now, this one here is based on a second pattern Schofield, designed in 1876 with a third patent date from 75. These were produced mostly between 77 and 78. They would build nearly 5,300, again, with the majority going to the military. And it really just went to a lower latch pin, which gave more leverage. They also made the rear of the cylinder a little different. But essentially, they made the second variant better for mass production and corrected a few things. And both would be ordered. Roughly 8,000 in the military, plus the original 1,000 from the American, means that 9,000 were sent to the Army cavalry throughout the 1870s. In fact, the 45 Schofield cartridge was declared the standard in 1875, even though it probably shouldn't have been. So yeah, she compares to the Colt. The hammer throw is less, too. Interesting. I was not expecting that. It doesn't have less recoil than the Colt, but it's more of a straight back. The Colt wants to kind of ride up, and the Schofield kind of just pushes back on you more. Has a little flip, of course, but yeah, that was interesting. It makes getting the hammer a little different. Of course, at least, you know, in theory. Ejection. Let's try that again with more force, more gusto. There we go. When the powers that be agreed to buy this gun, they did so if it could chamber the 45 Long Colt cartridge here. Well, they did make it for 45, but the 45 Schofield cartridge is a little bit shorter. The Colt cartridge is just under 1.3 inches. The Schofield was about 1.1 inches. More importantly, the Schofield round, to work with the extractor here, it had a wider larger rim. The rim on a Colt is pretty small. By the way, if you don't want to lift your extractor, you can press down here and it disengages it. So that makes sense. And it was a lighter bullet, about 230 grains at its max, I believe. And whereas the Colt had 40 grains of black powder, later this would be reduced to 30 and then 28 because, well, yeah. This would start off at around 26 grains, and some loads, I believe, were down to 23. And that's because this action is just not as strong. There's no way else to put it. So Smith & Wesson, Schofield, however, kind of, they were supposed to make one chambered for the standard round. They didn't. They made a 45 cartridge. So the idea was, okay, we'll make the 45 Schofield the standard round, not 45 Colt. And the theory was Colts can still shoot the Schofield round. In terms of length, this isn't a problem. It's a longer cylinder, so that'll work. The issue comes from the larger rim. This was meant for the relatively thin rim of the 45 Colt. So there are different reports from the era, but it seems like there could be issues because of the rim. Now, issues with this, trying to put Colt in it, it's too long. And the thin rim wouldn't always get engaged by the star extractor. Now, the modern reproductions from Birdie here, they've lengthened the cylinder just a teensy hair, and they've reworked it a bit. So this one is chambered for 45 Colt, but it will still work if you had it with 45 Smith & Wesson, 45 Schofield. So best of both worlds. That was the standard, but you can see the issue there. You've got two 45 cartridges in service, two different guns, and the cavalry, they're liking these, but, you know, at this point, the single action army here is already in service, its cartridges in service, but this is also kind of explaining why you don't see orders received from Colt and accepted, proofed in 1875, and then they start coming back in 1876, but in very small batches. Our next inspector was Cleveland, I believe, and under his time, he only inspected around 2,000 new peacemakers over about a 2 years time span. Now this one here, like I said, is Henry Nettleton, and he would inspect for a couple of years, 1878 or so in that period. He would do about 3,000 in 1 year. So they're ticking up again because, well, attitudes are changing. But before we get to the 1880s, there is one more competitor that kind of squeaked in at the very end of the Ordnance Board testing around 1876. Yeah, I am learning with you guys too. And that is, to me anyway, part of the fun. Hope it is for you. Feel free to donate if you want, because this ammo came from my pocket. But, like I said, trying to bring something new to the table, quite literally. Don't forget about Remington. The 1875. Sometimes called the Outlaw. Very much is taking the lines from the earlier 1858 we looked at last time. But this is always a metallic cartridge gun. And these were chambered for 45 Colt. And while they did make it into some of the early retests, by 1876, a small batch was sent in. And they were evaluated too, and not found lacking. But also, like, why? The other two guns already have such a head start. They don't need a three-way, and this really doesn't do anything that the Smith & Wesson or Colt doesn't do. It's a solid gun, and it did have its fans. They would build 25,000, 30,000 of these over a couple of year period. Sorry, my thing's kind of stuck up there. There we go. But it wasn't a failure. I mean, back then, that's a relatively large production, but it's just, yeah, didn't do a whole lot extra. It does have one neat feature. It's very easy to take the cylinder out. There's a spring-loaded pin here, and then you pull a rod out here. And that was important for black powder. Made it very easy to clean. Whereas with your Colt, you had to remove the front screw, and on the Pieta, you've got the knurled screw, but on the original guns, you had to have your screwdriver. And on the Schofield, you actually have to remove 2 screws, here and here. Not to mention the front pivot screw, if you want to take that apart. So this is definitely the most complicated. So I have to give credit to the Remington for being the easiest to field strip for cleaning. Again, and that's not insignificant in the black powder era. It also gives us one advantage in the modern era we'll get to later on in the video. It was there. They would purchase a few for testing and trials. Interestingly, in 1876, when there weren't enough Colt single-action armies because they hadn't got new ones in the supply chain yet, and the Schofields, they would pick up a handful of these, and they would actually go to the Buffalo soldiers, at least some of them. So there was limited use there. Also, sometimes scouts would have the 1875, and you see officers, occasionally private, purchasing them. And then finally, Remington would get probably its biggest single contract in 1880 from the government of Mexico. They would order 1,000. After that, the next big important one was Indian Territories lawmen would order about 650 total to issue around for that. And production would continue up until 1889 when it was replaced by the 1890, a pretty short-lived gun where they just made a couple of thousand, and it was kind of the end of the Remington revolver era, quite frankly. It's sad, but you know, after shooting all these, I do kind of get it, but I had to mention it in the video. I love the look of it, and people that I've shown this to say the color case hardening on this particular one is neat. It has the long 7.5-inch barrel, 2-piece walnut smooth grips. In fact, these are very smooth and have more of a shellacky, varnishy, shiny finish compared to the others. And the gun's a little oily, and my hands are a little sweaty, so I did notice they were a little bit slippery. All right, first shots out of the Remington 1875. So think of the 3. If I'm reaching the hammer on the Colt. The easiest. And let's see how she ejects. Gotta hit that with a little force. At least unlike last time's Remington, it has a spring, so. A little bit sticky in there, but not bad. Keep in mind, it is new. Yeah, it just kind of shoots like another revolver. It is kind of front heavy because of all this. It's overall a pretty balanced gun, but small grip, front heavy. Let's set the Outlaw aside. We will come back to it before the end of the video and come back to the Schofield because its story, at least as far as U.S. Cavalry, you know, it got a second chance. 8,000 purchased is not insignificant considering how small the U.S. military was back then. But, you know, there was that nepotism of little Schofield, big Schofield. Smith & Wesson wasn't super stoked about this gun because they had to pay royalties to Major Schofield on his patent part on their own gun. They felt like they were paying royalties on their own gun, and all he really did was redesign the latch and a few other small things. So that's why there's not a huge commercial market of these. They produced many more of the Russian models, and even the new model, number 3, would come about pretty much right after they finished with this production in 1878, 1879, and they would leave it in the dust. Interestingly, they would also leave the Schofield latch in the dust. Yeah, once they started really using these, and because of the ammo stuff, first of all, they realized these guns required a little more maintenance. They were a little more finicky. Yes, they were easy to use on horseback. That was a big plus. But beyond that, they just weren't as durable as the solid frame Colt. Yes, with the loading gate, this was slower to load and unload on a horseback. But it was just a good Universal Army gun. And they were going to have to pick which cartridge to go with. And in the end, they kind of picked neither. Let's see if this works. That's about what I expected to happen. In the early 1880s, they made basically what was considered a .45 government cartridge. This was designed at the Frankfurt Arsenal, and it took the kind of lighter powder charge of the Schofield round and combined it with the Colt. Now, they did reduce the bullet weight a bit. I believe it went from 255 to 250 or 245 grains, so a little bit lighter bullet, less powder behind. I believe they settled on 28 grains, maybe 29, because that 40 grain 255 was just walloping the crap out of people. And they realized that the Schofield was just more pleasant to shoot, quicker to get back on target, and just soldiers were more accurate with it. It just worked better. So this did lead to that. And that cartridge, the .45 government, was meant to work in both guns. So it kind of split the difference in rims. So we do eventually have a universal cartridge. But by this time, these are already kind of falling out of service. In fact, already by 1880, some of the guns are being sold off as surplus or, private to corporations. They're still in frontline use in 1885, but increasingly less and less so. And then there was a big sell-off in 1887, 1890, which actually gives us the so-called Wells Fargo guns that are kind of cool. This has a 7-inch barrel, not 7.5, but 7. They would be cut down to 5-inchers. And these guns were popular, all the different number 3s. And that kind of gets us to talking about the end of the Schofield and where the 5.5-inch Colt comes from. And the one really kind of neat feature that the Remington offers us from Uberti here. The less fun way. I will say having a longer barrel on this one really does help with manipulation. But I do find reaching the hammer on the Schofield from my hands harder. I think if we had a misfire there. No? Hell, seems spent. Okay. Then it's just me. Of course, you can spin the cylinder, so I could see that happening, spinning on. And either way, which was, you think it's strange, but back in the day, that's just kind of how revolvers were. Wells Fargo got nearly 3,000 surplus guns by 1890, 1891 from the government. Most were the second model here, but this is like a few of the first original models were there. These are sometimes called express guns or company guns. And they would be, I don't know if they cut the barrels or rebarreled them, but I think they just cut the barrels down to 5 inches. Some would get refinished. They would inspect them, stamp them. And yeah, those would be used by their agents for a good long while. Even after these round of sell-offs, there still were several hundred, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 at most left in inventory. And a few would be knocking about in backwater areas during the Spanish-American War. And there are maybe a couple still around in someone's holster by the Philippine Americans thing, 1899, 1900, that period. But by this point, it's considered obsolete. What's left, it's not just complete junk, is just sold off to the commercial private market through like retail stores and whatnot. I don't know how many were left at this point, but it could not have been a huge number, but the ones that were out there were pretty popular. You saw some people, companies refurbishing them, giving them nickel finishes, different chamberings. It was a really interesting gun. It never quite, yeah, never quite made it. But it was kind of the secondary gun for a time and had some success. Unfortunately, the story for Major Schofield doesn't end well. He actually would get promoted to lieutenant colonel, but he would also contract syphilis, which is not good for your brain and the rest of you. And unfortunately, he used one of these to, let's say, end his suffering in 1882. Even if he maybe got what he did, because he did make royalties on these, which is, again, kind of a conflict of interest. There was a lot of dirty pool going on, but this was also the Teapot Dome scandal era anyway. He didn't deserve that end, in my opinion, but that's what he chose to do. So that's kind of the end of the story there. If you don't have anything in and you don't want to have the extractor come out, you can press down here and it disengages, which is, good to save wear and tear. Or if you needed to do a partial reload, I could see. It's nice to have the option, I think. I wish the table wasn't kind of at an angle today. Everything wants to kind of roll off. Well, let's see how the real Black Hills does. Again. Back to the 1875, as I promised. This actually comes with this. A second cylinder. Here we have the 45 Colt cylinder. Here we have a cylinder meant for 45 ACP. And that means we can take advantage of the spring-loaded catch and system. And it's pretty easy to switch them out and shoot the more modern cartridge. Now let's try the other cylinder and the Remington 45 ACP. I think I'll win pretty well if I don't drop one. See how it does. Cock. Yeah. My hands are oily. I was plenty of different guns. I should have got them off, but oh well. That's fun. Let's see how easy this is to eject. So put it in half cock. Still learning too, guys. Yeah, it's ejecting these a little easier than that Colt ammo. Hands are super greasy, and these grips are super not grippy. A lot of fun, though. It is a lot of fun in the modern round, and a little more affordable. Again, you can get the conversion cylinders for both Pieta and Uberti. They're not interchangeable, but you can get them for each, but you do have to remove a screw. Now, if you go to the pre-war model that has actually a very similar system to this, then you can pretty easily switch them out on the single action army as well, but I wasn't really interested in the pre-war model. But now I guess it's time to talk about why I did not get for my own personal use, a 7.5-inch cavalry version, and why I went with the artillery version here. And we'll talk about the service long after the Schofield of the Peacemaker. Had to move back to the Colt after shooting the other couple there. Yeah, the way it kind of jumps in your hand makes getting to that easier. And, you know, the ejection on the Schofield is fun, but I can see where it wouldn't always work or fall out. This is just, yeah, I get what they're going at. Just, it works. It's positive. It definitely feels like a better ejector compared to the Remingtons. Sorry, Remington, I like you as a gun, but yeah. It's easy to see why this stayed so popular for so long. The government would get their last Schofields 1877, 1878, and that was it. And Smith & Wesson themselves, that was it for them too. And that did slow down reception of the single action army, but it would speed back up again by 1880. We'd have a new Inspector Clark, and he would be there probably the longest of any one single person, up there about 1887, 1888. And he would approve over 13,000 guns. Now, these weren't one big batch. The government was getting 100 here, 150 there, slow but continuous over most of that decade. And there would be very few changes. This gun had just small detail changes here and there, but almost identical. And then our final batches would be under one more inspector, Carr, C-A-R-R. Let's talk about the cavalry draw, aka I'll embarrass myself for your entertainment. And so we have the kind of ammo carrier here. A lot of times cavalry would have two of them on their belt, but not always. And then we have the cavalry holster. This is the half flap style. These were often private purchased or used later in the 1880s, 1890s. The full flap is a more common thing, but I tend to like it this way. And yeah, the butt points forward as such, and we have a snap here as such. Some of these actually had two different attachment points for either a Schofield or a Colt, but this one, it's just the one for the 1873 style, and of course the 5.5-inch cut versus the 7.5-inch. So you might be wondering, cross draw for your left hand? No, the left hand was for reins. They were always training the cavalry to use their right hand for their sidearm. So the basic method would be take your hand, push it, hold your flap open, turn it around, pull it up, and do. Now, this was meant for single-handed use on horseback. Reholstering is a more elaborate affair. But that's not near as important as, getting it out and getting it ready. Yeah, you can see how it could get pretty quick. The nice thing about a revolver when I'm pointing it at the camera is you can see the chambers are not loaded there. And why am I sitting on a stool outside? Well, that's because this works okay when seated, i.e. on horseback. But when standing up, the way things kind of hang, you can still do it, but you don't have that leverage the way it hangs quite right. So if they were on the ground, sometimes cavalry would get a holster with the butt facing in reverse, or even a cross draw. This really was designed for the way on a horse. In late 1889, the government would order 2,000 more, still in this cavalry style here, and he would inspect those as Colt would deliver them. And then we would get one more order for 2,000 final in September of 1890. And the last of these would be accepted by late June of 1891. This is pretty much the last important official batch of new Colt single action armies in inventory, because the next year, 1892, the same year the Craig Jorgensen was adopted, they would adopt the Colt double action, the 1892 and 38 Colt, 38 Long Colt, essentially the Navy's cartridge. The Navy had actually adopted it, or a version of it, in 1889. I do not have one to show you. That is one of the missing guns in my collection, be it replica or original. Got a little replica pouch that carries a dozen 45 rounds. Pretty cool. The original ones here had little tin dividers, but they usually got bent, broken. A lot of them got taken out in service, and so I guess the replicas, they just don't put them in, so they're a little more flexible. Still, pretty cool web gear, and just reach in and grab your shells out. And with that, it would not be all that long before the 7.5-inch full-sized, full-weight version would be out of service. Now, these would hang on for a few more years. But with the 1892 coming in, it wouldn't be much. Now, I should just mention before you move on, the Navy really didn't go for the single-action army, but they did have a small order between 1873 and 1876 for 1,000 to 2,000 pieces. So a few did go to the Navy, but they kind of stuck with their cartridge conversion guns. The 38 Colt would be their preferred round, and then they would go to the 1889 and then the 1892 for the Army. That's that. However, the story's far from over, because now we can finally talk about and wind the video down with my gun here, the artillery model. Oh, let's shoot the Peacemaker again. Why not? I really do like this size and configuration. Very happy I discovered it at the last minute. Yeah, we'll do a full cylinder. We haven't done that yet. This, not exactly safe, and this doesn't have any added modern safeties, so, you know. Now our next click back, that basically locks up the cylinder, and so our final click gets us ready for action. And action it is. I don't know what it is, but something about the Peacemaker I find easier to reach the hammer than on just about any other single action. The ergonomics, they work for me. That should have been it. Yeah. Yep. Back on half cock to eject, and I would definitely say this, out of pretty much everything, is my favorite ejector. Should have been it. That's just a sound. It's a vibe. Good times. The days are getting shorter. Soon it'll be twilight, but we're getting towards the end of the video and of the single action army service. but it does have a couple of more important chapters left. In 1895, 1896, the U.S. government would send about 2,000 back to the Colt factory for a spit polish, a refurb, a rework, a retool, because they didn't have enough 38 caliber 1892s, and this is still in 45, that's in 38. Of those, 800 would just be the 7.5-inch gun, and those, I believe, would go to like the New York militia. A lot of those would be out, but 1,200 would have their barrels down to 5.5 inches. Some sources say cut down, some sources say a rebarrel. I have a feeling Colt would just do a rebarrel, because if these guns needed refreshing, their bores are probably pretty shot out because they've been firing black powder for 20 years. And now, these are just called altered revolvers, altered pistols in ordnance documents, government documents. But the 5.5-inch version would first be given to artillery batteries, artillery crews, hence the collector's name and much cooler name of the artillery model here, which makes, perfect sense. So that was a little batch there. Then the Spanish-American War happened in 1898, and that's actually why I really wanted this gun, because it's a great companion to this gun here, which is an original. This is my 1896 Springfield Craig Jorgensen carbine, used in that war famously by the U.S. volunteer, the first U.S. volunteer, the Rough Riders. And alongside those, many of them carried these. They made these quite famous. But other infantry groups, artillery groups would pull these as well. Maybe there wouldn't be enough 38s available, maybe they preferred 45s. But, 1,200 is not enough. So, as an emergency measure for wartime, the Springfield Armory would take nearly 15,000, it's like 14,900 something, older single-action armies, refresh them, refurbish them, and give them 5.5-inch barrels. Now, the first batch of 1,200, those are mostly pulled from like the Henry Nettleton-proofed guns. The second batch would be newer guns from either Clark or Kerr, so 1880s into the early 1890s. Fun fact, too, the acceptance stamp was moved to the right side of the grip on those late guns, like this one here. So that's a pretty good number. That means almost half of the existing single-action armies were reworked with shorter barrels and then sent into the Spanish-American War, mostly seeing service in like Cuba and Puerto Rico, and of course being issued stateside as well. I think that's a really cool thing. I should also point out that a lot of these were not serial matched. Springfield Armory, they weren't really. Now, the Colt refurbished guns tended to have matching cylinders and frames and all that, but a lot of the ones done in a hurry for the war, that they didn't care. They were just using up parts. So they made a name for themselves there. And then this would continue the next year with the American involvement in the Philippines. Black Hills. Single action. Oh yeah, that's definitely got some more. All right, now we're kind of getting somewhere. Sorry, guys. I didn't let it pull something. It's a very famous story now that the Moros over there, the 38 Colt cartridge, which just wasn't cutting it in the jungles. Now, about hitting people and them not going down, did they not go down, or were they just missing? But one thing I can say, in a jungle environment with all that foliage, yeah, a 45 slug is going to do better. I should also mention it's right around this time that smokeless powder is approved for use in the single-action army, too. So what they'll do, they'll send them over there. And they're still issuing these out, sending these out 1901, 1902 to different batteries stateside, the Philippines. And then there's another refurbishment program between 1900 and 1903. Around 5,000, 5,200 more are sent to Colt for a spit polish after the Spanish-American War. So they're very much around. And that's because people are very much not happy with the model 1892. Well, really more its cartridge, which gave this one legs, and actually would lead to the 1878 Philippine-Alaskan contract Colt in 45. Kind of an interesting side note, but it would directly lead to, well, this model. I feel like I'm kind of doing what 19th century Army and others did, forgetting the Remington. It's a good gun, but it just, compared to the Colt and the Smith & Wesson, kind of gets overshadowed. So let's use the last 4 cartridges in this box of Black Hills on it. You know, the Colt has the sturdy reliability, kind of really good ergos. Smith & Wesson has the novelty and one-handed use. Yeah. And, well, this has a sail. I mean, that's one thing to recommend it. Alright, finishing off the box with the Remington Outlaw. Back in Long Colt versus ACP. Definitely more thump than that ACP. Revolvers, guys. You know, nothing can go wrong, right? Yeah, something's a little gobbledygook there. Well, that always happens to me on the last rounds of the day. Oh, there we go. Why didn't you guys tell me? The pin, when I was swapping cylinders, I thought I seated it good, but that could be a me mistake. I don't know. Okay, now it's definitely seated. It clicked before, but maybe it, you know, didn't. Find out. All right, well, again, in these videos, you're learning with me. And even if you hear a click, double check that that is securely seated. I guess the good news is when it's not, it just kind of stops itself. And I didn't have to disassemble it or even open the loading gate to fix it. I had to push it back in, so it really wasn't an issue there. Now, see how our ejection is. With that HSM ammo, it was a little sticky. But this Black Hills seems easier. A little more than the others, but still easier than the... yeah, I'm just going to say the chambers in this are just a teeny bit tighter. Either that or the ejector doesn't quite hit with as much center force. It is a good gun, but what does it do that the others can't? Now, of course, with this one, the answer is shoot 45 ACP. You know, in 1875, that wasn't exactly an option. The model 1909. Okay, this is a model 1917, but 1917 is basically just a model 1909, but instead of being in 45 Colt, it's in 45 automatic Colt pistol ACP. That's what we're going to talk about in the next episode, but I will just say to kind of close this one out, they really are still appreciated, especially folks like Teddy Roosevelt, the single-action Army, and its hard-hitting cartridge. And that would lead to the large-frame, double-action 45 Colt swing-out cylinder 1909, which is interesting because that was ordered when trials and testing for the 1911 were very well underway. In fact, it would be adopted in 2 years. But that's how much they felt the need. So the 1999 was an interim solution. It would continue on until they had enough 1911s. That's how much they didn't like the 1892, at least by this point after the experience in the Philippines. And then, of course, yeah, for World War I, they would take the 1909 and redo the cylinder and make this gun. Well, Smith & Wesson would, and Colt would follow suit. That's next time. We're going to talk about these. And, of course, this is an original. You've seen it before. But well, I would love to have an original single-action army with true military provenance. The prices today and the really ability to shoot them, nah, it's not there. This one, I can shoot, and I really enjoy doing so. It's actually a lot more fun than I anticipated. All right, let's try this Schofield with some Black Hills. Let me know what you think. This style here has just nice balance. And when people say revolvers are reliable, this is what they're thinking of. Because revolvers, they're complicated. There's a lot that can and does go wrong with them. But it's the single-action army, really, that gave the reputation for just bulletproof reliability initially. Ironically, double-action swing-out cylinder guns like this, in some ways, to my mind, they're even more reliable because you have all this exposed, you know, to eject and stuff. But next time, we'll get into the Great War and all that. Hope you've enjoyed kind of this look at the Cimarron, the Uberti guns. Again, probably the reason I dove so deep into them is because I just happened to meet a good sales rep. He, you know, was good at his job and took his time with me, as I said in the first video. So one more shot at it as we kind of close this out. Let me know what you think. Do you own any of these? If so, pros, cons, what was your experience? Love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you'd like to help support us, yeah, check out the link to Patreon, or you can do a super thanks on YouTube here. With that, this is Misha, and next time I promise Peanut will be in the video.